It's really a pleasure and honor to be here, especially with my holy brother. I always call Yossi my holy brother in the Holy Land. And Rabbi David and all the organizers, it's really a distinct pleasure and honor to be here. But also, it shouldn't go unnoticed. When you invite a Muslim, you get the Yom Kippur crowd. So it's good for business. I hope there will be more encouragement to invite many more diverse speakers, as you have already been doing so. My journey with my holy brother in the Holy Land is really an important one, and I am eternally grateful to my mentor, my friend, my teacher, Yossi Landa, who's in the audience today. When I came to Hartford Seminary as a graduate student, I took his class, and he assigned Yossi Klein Halevi's one of the least successful books.
In the history of publishing.
In that book, Yossi, in a post-First Intifada, made incredible journeys to the world of Islam and Muslims, as well as Christianity, where he visited Muslim worship spaces, mosques. He visited various Palestinian Muslim communities, both in West Bank and Gaza. He wanted to understand his neighbor's faith tradition. And if you haven't read that book, don't worry, not many people have seen it. But I was one of those lucky ones, as we say in Islam, Baruch Hashem. Got my hands on it through this incredible mentor of mine. And it came in response to my prayers, because as I often introduce myself, I am a recovering anti-Semite. I am a recovering anti-Semite because I grew up in a country and society in 1980s in the southeastern part of Turkey. Very early on, I was subjected to incredibly despicable but successful, sophisticated propaganda. Before the age of 15, let me tell you 3 books that I read about Jews and Judaism. The first book I read at the age of 12 was the children's versions of the Protocols of Elders of Zion, the children's version. And the second book was Henry Ford's International Jew. And of course, the third book was Mein Kampf. So before the age of 15, you get sufficient amount of poison into your system. And again, Baruch Hashem, God of mercy and compassion, didn't allow me to stay in that state of poison and hate. What saved me is 2 things. One, I went to madrasa to become an imam. I became very religious. I studied Quran, I studied mainstream Islamic theology. And over time, the Islam that I study, the Prophet Muhammad that I fall in love, I couldn't reconcile with the kind of poison that I have swallowed. And I say poison, I'm not exaggerating. It's not like having negative views against Jews and Judaism. There were a number of years I was so passionately and in clarity made to believe that the Jews as people, Judaism as a religion is absolute evil, irredeemable evil. And therefore, and if you are exposed to that hate, that level of hate early on, it gets into your system so deeply that that's why I am saying I'm a recovering one. Because the recovery from that amount of poison early on requires lifelong struggle, lifelong journey. And even though studying Islam slowed me down in that highway of hate, what ultimately made me took the nearest exit and drive in the opposite direction was meeting with people like Yossi, Yecheskel, Rabbi Michael Goldman, who is also in the audience, who enabled me to see the beauty and the joy and the presence of God in Judaism, among Jewish communities, in their stories. So when I read Yossi's ability to make those incredible journeys to the world of Islam, his incredibly powerful, respectful language to my religion, the way he revered the beauty within my tradition. I was at the very important juncture of my recovery, and I immediately wrote to him and said, I want to reciprocate. The kind of journey that you made to the world of Islam, I want to make a similar journey to the world of Jews and Judaism. And let him now continue the story.
But before he does, I want to understand what made you even pick up a book like his. Was there some turn that happened because you just got older? What suddenly made you recover as you?
Studying Islam, as I said, really shook me up. And I tried to read anything and everything which will help me in my recovery from there on. But being in the class of Yechezkel Landau, it was just a blessing. I don't think I would have gotten his book, and I would have gotten to know him, because they are good friends. They've been together for many, many decades. It was in the class that I took for Jewish spirituality and interfaith peace building that Yechezkel assigned that book to us. That's how I read. And it made an incredible impact on me.
Good evening, everyone. And Abby, it's wonderful to be back with you. And so when I get this email from someone I didn't know with this strange name, Abdullah Antepli, and he introduces himself as a Turkish-born imam, and he said, I'd read your book, and you know the writer's joke, oh, you're the one? And it actually wasn't that far from the truth. One of the reasons for why this book earned its place in publishing obscurity is that the publication date was September 11th, 2001. And that was not an auspicious date to come out with a book about Muslim-Jewish reconciliation. The book was called At the Entrance to the Garden of Eden. It's actually being re-released, God willing, this coming year. Hope springs eternal. So this email that I get from Abdullah really threw me, because Abdullah wrote me about how deeply he was touched by this book. And the reason it threw me is that I had emotionally distanced myself from the book by this time. For several reasons. First of all, because it really was such a resounding failure, and you have to really move on to the next project. But more deeply, because of the timing. Not only did it come out on 9/11, but that for me was a kind of metaphor for a much deeper trauma as an Israeli, which was the Second Intifada. And the book came out at the height of the suicide bombings. And like most Israelis, my reading of what had happened with the failure of the Oslo process was that Israel had made a sincere effort in the year 2000 with former Prime Minister Barak to end the occupation. And what we got back in return were the worst years of terrorism in our history. So what was so shattering for most of us in Israel, and this is something I think that American Jews have not fully internalized, which is how the Second Intifada was really an historic watershed. It transformed Israeli politics, psychology for a generation, and we're still seeing the reverberations of that. And so the book comes out in the middle of the suicide bombings, and Abdullah tells me how much he appreciated this book, and I really did not want to own that book anymore. And what I was worried about, in particular with that book, was that it would feed a certain well-intentioned liberal naivete. That, well, you see, here's an Israeli Jew who went on a journey into Palestinian society, and he had all these wonderful spiritual experiences. And I would get these emails from time to time, mostly from mainline Protestants, who told me how touched they were by the book. And I would actually get angry, saying, look what's happening every day in the streets of Israel. And don't tell me that peace is possible because I had a moving experience in a Sufi mosque in Gaza. So that's where Abdullah Antepli stepped into my life. And Abdullah came to Israel. He brought a group of students. At that time, you were at Wesleyan. And he was the Muslim chaplain at Wesleyan. He brought a group of students. And he invited me to speak, and I knew that this was a setup. Because the person Abdullah invited to speak was the person who had written that book. But the person who showed up to speak was not the author of that book. I was a very angry and traumatized Israeli in 2003, 2004, is that when you came? And Abdullah asked me afterwards, he said, what are you doing for Muslim-Jewish reconciliation? And I said, nothing. He said, why not? I said, because there's nothing to do. And Abdullah, as I've since learned, is a very patient man. And he said, okay, that's where you are now, but you and I will work for healing this. We will work together to heal this wound. And my response was, good luck with that. And fast forward about 10 years later, at this point I was a fellow at the Hartman Institute, and Abdullah came to me with a proposal that we would jointly create under Hartman auspices a program to teach emerging Muslim American leaders about Judaism, Israel, and Zionism, the Z word. And Abdullah asked if Hartman would agree to serve as the home for this project. And with all the authority that was not invested in me, I said, of course. And the reason for that was I really didn't believe that anything would come of this. Muslim American leaders are not going to go to a Zionist institution in Jerusalem to study Judaism and Israel. A few weeks later, Abdullah sends me a who's who list of young Muslim American leaders, just a fantastic group of people. And so I went to Daniel Hartman, the head of the institute. I said, we have a problem. It seems they're serious. And so Daniel said, well, we'll create a program. We'll create the program and we'll worry about funding afterwards. That's the Hartman approach. And the funding will come if it's the right program, and it did. As Abdullah would say, Baruch Allah. And so we are now entering cohort 6. Over 100 people have gone through various stages of the program. It is transformative both for the individual participants. It's transformative, I think, for the two of us. And it has certainly changed my life.
So, Abdullah, I just want to ask, I know you insisted that this happen in Israel, that there was a proposal that you're not going to get people there and it's really complicated to suggest that. Why did you feel so strongly?
Not only I insisted, as also I know you read extensively, this program received incredible amount of pushback, criticism, especially from certain political activism, the amount of visceral reaction, death threats, public shaming campaigns, character assassination. And most of it is because of two main reasons. Because we are going to Israel, and because participants are not fig leaf Muslims that nobody doesn't know. Participants, almost all of them, they have a standing and credibility in the mainstream Muslim communities. They are not like a nobody knows kind of people. If I would have done this program here in New York, the world's largest Jewish city, I think we wouldn't have faced in any of these difficulty. I believe I insisted doing it in the Israelis because I fell in love with Shalom Hartman's education. I saw what they did in 40 years to Jewish life globally, both in Israel as well as in the United States. I heard the kind of teaching that my community, I feel, needs and doesn't get a chance to hear much. Most of my community heard about the story of Jews, Judaism, Zionism, and Israel as a post-Holocaust reality. The only Zionism we know, only Israel we know, is born out of Auschwitz, born out of a crisis after the Second World War in Europe. But never the Zionism of longing, never the biblical, spiritual, religious connection to the land. That Zionism that born out of Sinai. And it was really interesting. When we first decided the program, Yossi sent me the curriculum about Judaism, halakha, law. I said, this is all wrong. You have to teach us Zionism. You have to teach us how you see these terms and how these terms and sense of nationalism play in the life of many Jews all around the world. I sent the curriculum back. I said, you have to focus. This program is not about teaching Muslims about religion. Most Muslims have no problem understanding, appreciating, respecting to a certain extent, understanding Judaism as a religion. I think our learning disability or difficulty is understanding Jews and Judaism in their connection to a particular land. Understanding this story not as a post-colonial land grabbing, expelling Palestinians, but going back home, re-establishing their fulfillment of their religious imagination. And why also you are both religion as well as a people. And that peoplehood has connection to a particular story, particular land. We don't have to agree any of these stories. But we have to make sure, at least we get a chance to sort of go onto the aisle and see the overall psychological makeup of the Jewish world, understand these realities.
And let me just ask, when people say, but why is this not reciprocal? Why are Muslims, why are Jews not getting the same education in MLI?
I think onus is on the Muslim side, not on the Jewish side. When I create Muslim Shalom Hartman, and when I have a Jewish organization, and when I create a Muslim organization under the same roof like Shalom Hartman, has the kind of progressive, inclusive, but also very, very self-critical, broad spectrum of curriculum to teach Islam, Muslim cultures, Palestinian narrative, I think many Jews will come. We don't have Muslim Shalom Hartman. We don't have that institution. It's in the making from day one. But since the organizational structure, the setup, the means is not there, it will take a little bit longer time. But that's my lifelong. I will not die before I create JLI, as we call it, Jewish Leadership Initiative. And one of the main reasons also I wanted to make sure we go to Israel is, with this, we would like to create the kind of goodwill. Many Muslims in America, I would say overwhelming majority of the Muslims, they would say we are two-statist. We believe in the two-state solution. We believe the peaceful two nations living side by side and thriving in peace and prosperity. But talk is cheap. What's dividing us, what's polarizing us, what's giving rise to Jewish anti-Muslim bigotry or Muslim anti-Semitism, which is a much greater problem, is like serious issues. And therefore, there is so much skepticism, there's so much lack of trust and fear between our communities. The goodwill act that you would like to go through this firewall has to be strong enough. And by going there, I felt it's such a wonderful way of making this question, where are the moderate Muslims? Why are they not trying to do anything? Is almost going to be impossible to ask. Because you will see rows of them going and trying to understand that narrative, which will create an incredible goodwill, especially here in North America.
I want to pick up on that goodwill idea. In terms of the idea of goodwill, I'm sure you've heard this before, it can sound a little bit like rainbows and sunsets. I mean, this is an incredibly bloody, fractured history, and the hatred continues. And the lack of communication and lack of relationship continues. What you have incubated here is extraordinary, but it is a tiny speck in the stream, in the ocean of all of this. So Yossi, how do you respond to people who say it's naive and, frankly, that in some ways it's whitewashing the difficulties?
It's hard to really know where to start because it's like what Abdullah was saying earlier, that where are the moderate Muslims? Well, here are over 100 leading figures in the Muslim American community who have devoted a year of their lives to studying who we are and have taken tremendous risks to their personal status, their place in their community. People have lost livelihood. And the reason they've done that is to signal to the American Jewish community that they're here. And they're here and they want to engage with you seriously, much less than engage with me. I'm really, in a sense, almost the means to a different goal, which is to have a deeper engagement between Muslims and Jews in probably the one place on the planet where that can happen in a reasonably civil way, and that's this country. So MLI is really a gift to the American Jewish community. And so that would be my first answer. The second, in terms of this being a drop in the ocean, it depends which way you look at it. it is certainly not a drop in the ocean in the American Muslim community. MLI has created a transformation in large parts of the American Muslim community, in the community discourse. This past year, well, you sit on the council that brings together the American Jewish Committee and ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America, which is the largest Muslim American organization. These two organizations have never worked together before. And one of the reasons that they've come together is because of MLI and the behind-the-scenes work that you did, Abdullah. And so MLI really broke the taboo within the Muslim American community on partnering with pro-Israel Jewish organizations. The Jews that ISNA had at its annual conferences for all these years were either Neturei Karta, the anti-Zionist ultra-Orthodox, who represent all of 200 families, and Jewish Voice for Peace. You know, those are the good Jews. And now, thanks to MLI, there is the beginnings of a transformation in the mainstream.
And just to push you a little bit, Yossi, for those who say it sounds kind of like they're coming halfway or three-quarters of the way, what are you learning from, even if there isn't yet a Muslim MLI, what are you learning that is ultimately making you understand the Palestinian perspective? I mean, that's what your entire new book is about, which is I think invaluable to people. But where have you turned because of these conversations and this learning that's gone on?
Well, the response that I described earlier to the response that I gave to Abdullah in 2004, which was I wanted nothing to do anymore with Muslim-Jewish dialogue. I thought it was a waste of time. I certainly wanted nothing to do with Palestinian-Israeli dialogue. 2004, height of the Second Intifada, that was the last thing on my agenda. And like most Israelis, I went into a kind of deep freeze, both politically and emotionally, where the status quo became the only possible option for Israel. And the status quo, of course, is an illusion. There's no such thing as a status quo, because what the status quo does is create a void in which the most committed groups in society can enter and transform reality. In our case, it's the settlement movement. The settlement movement has not been part of the status quo over these years of the deep freeze in Israeli society, and they've been very actively changing reality on the ground. But it was really the encounter with MLI, with Abdullah and his friends, that forced me to start seeing my neighbors on the hill across the way again. I live in a neighborhood called French Hill in Jerusalem, the very edge of Jerusalem, and the security barrier, which is a wall outside of Jerusalem, is literally across from my porch. And so every day I wake up and I go to sleep to the view of the porch. And I learned over those years to not see. I learned to look over the wall. And what the experience of MLI forced me to do was really re-enter that place of empathy. And I couldn't be in a position where I'm teaching Muslim American leaders how I, as an Israeli, view this conflict, view our history, without listening to them. And we also have Palestinian Americans in our cohorts. And so I've been forced out of this, what I described as a deep freeze, and back into a very difficult relationship, but nevertheless an active relationship with my neighbors, which was suspended with the Second Intifada. And it was only when Abdullah began organizing MLI that I felt I needed in some way to.
And in some ways, you are not unique. The entire institution went through that kind of transformation. I will never forget another anecdote. We are putting this program together for the first cohort, and I told them, these are religious Muslims. We pray 5 times a day. Make sure the prayer times, Muslim prayer times, will include in the program. So lunch breaks, other coffee breaks should coincide with. And then this wonderful, lovely lady who spent 3 decades in Jerusalem calling me from Jerusalem to North Carolina, Durham, North Carolina. What are prayer times in Jerusalem? I said, what? Like, what are your prayer times? What are your prayer times? So I said, you are calling Durham, North Carolina to find out from Jerusalem. Just open the windows. Look at Aqsa. It's incredible. It's a very, how much, as Yossi beautifully put it, you sort of learn how not to see that reality. Muslims started praying 5 times a day because of Jerusalem. Muslims' story of praying is all around the story of Aqsa. It's incredible. But we came a long way since then. Yes, Yossi?
Yeah, I would just like to answer your question about naivete from a naive religious perspective. Because I think that at its basis, being a religious person is a kind of contrived naivete, a willful naivete. And there is something profoundly naive in what Abdullah and I are doing. But what reinforces my sense of faith in this work, and really my sense of divine providence, is that in the late 1990s, I went on this eccentric one-person journey as a religious Jew into Islam, into Palestinian Islam. I published this book, which one person read, but it turned out to have been, this book turned out to have been meant for one person. And as a result of my lone journey as a religious Jew into Islam, 100 Muslim American leaders have taken a reciprocal journey into Judaism. And what that teaches me as a religious person is that if your motives and your actions are intended for service, are intended for divine service, service to humanity, there is inevitably an echo. And whatever you do, which in the, quote, real world, the world of politics, may seem like a drop in the ocean, ultimately, you don't know how your actions will reverberate. And you may never know. But I believe that any action that's taken from a place of deep goodwill will find its resonance.
So, Abdullah, do you fight with Yossi?
All the time. Our partnership is, in many ways, a spiritual partnership. We are co-parenting 100 Muslims. So anybody who parent any children, you will see. Because the essence...
They're harder than Jewish kids. Jewish kids are hard.
Yes. Because the goal of the program is not to convince each other. The goal of the program is not to arrive into a consensus, political solutions. The goal of the program is open a space in the hearts and minds of people whom you have long list of political and sometimes moral disagreements. And some of these disagreements are almost unbridgeable, irreconcilable. So the task is, how can you bring people close enough? How over these political disagreements, strategic disagreements, factual disagreements, and build overarching moral arguments. And that's such a painful process. That's such a very painful process that you clearly look at the same reality and you see different things. Yossi and many people at Shalom Hartman and Israel look at Gaza and look at these people marching towards the fence, and they see a different kind of reality. And most Muslims like myself see different, very different, almost like a different, totally different reality. And therefore, that comes into incredibly painful disagreements sometimes. Yossi wrote a recent article at New York Times. Again, without losing, because I know he's a moral person. I believe and I testify his moral integrity. That in many ways, what we are doing is a masochistic situation. Back in the day when I thought Zionists were a bunch of racist, heartless, ruthless occupiers, it doesn't pain me what they do. But now that I fall in love with their moral imagination, I fall in love with Judaism's incredibly beautiful articulation of justice, respect for human life. How can you see this differently then?
Well, can we get a little more concrete about that? Because I mean, Gaza, we've just lived through it. This,
We are still living it.
right, but I mean, it's particularly this blow up around Independence Day and the anniversary. How do you navigate that kind of that moment together, and how honest are you when he writes something that he disagrees with? I mean, give us the blueprint for those of us who are struggling ourselves with events that we see.
We have been friends and partners since 2003. We are talking about 15 years of friendship. And we went through this, as you know, Middle East never ceases to provide this cycle of violence over and over. What really keeps us in relationship and friendship is that absolute clarity and trust that we were able to establish over time. Absolute trust that we are moral people. And also, a little bit on the technical side, me and many of my friends learn how to be in solidarity with Palestinians, how to be in solidarity with Palestinian suffering with the kind of language not to trigger existential threat in the Jewish community, not to push them into scratching their old wounds, if I may say so. And I think our teachers who taught us that language invite us into their internal conversation. Also, they learn over time how to be empathetic, empathize with Palestinians without being too apologetic to their own narrative, without entirely become defensive, self-hating person.
So let's again just take these latest events, or speak to your book without you having realized they were going to happen. You talk about that there are two rights of return, that there are two kind of calls for return, both from Jews and from Palestinians. Can you talk about that? Because essentially the Gaza protest is about return. And then again, how we are supposed to empathize and then answer it in some way concretely so that there are needs being met on both sides.
So Abby, maybe I'll take a step back and provide a little bit of context about this book. And it does, as I say, come out of the MLI experience, and it comes out of that place of empathy, on the one hand, empathy for the Palestinians, but without losing the integrity of the Jewish story. And what so often troubles me about the discourse in the Jewish community is that one side is trying to defend the Israeli narrative, which is under increasing assault, and the other part of the Jewish community is struggling to maintain the hope of peace and two-state solution. And so the sensibility of this book is that empathy for the Palestinians does not contradict defending the Jewish narrative. In fact, I would say that in the 21st century, the two really must go together. And the tension in this book, the creative tension for me, was trying to figure out how to hold these two forces in balance, how to be empathic while maintaining the authenticity and from my strong point of view, the truth of the Jewish narrative. So that brings us to the question of rights of return. And my starting point is that one of the reasons why the diplomats continually fail in their attempts to bring peace is because they've avoided coming to terms with the fact that for both sides, the entirety of the little land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea belongs by right to them. Each side, from its own perspective, can make a compelling argument about why the whole land belongs to them. Palestinians do not want a state in the West Bank and Gaza. In 2018, we know that the Palestinian National Movement wants a state from the river to the sea. Now that doesn't particularly faze me because I want the same thing for my people, for my country. I believe that between the river and the sea is all mine, to use the language of the Mishnah, Kula Sheli. But that's my starting point. It's not my end point. The question that I pose to both sides is, what is your starting point? We share the same starting point, but what is our end point? If the starting point and the end point are the same, there's nothing to talk about. But if we both start from the point of a maximalist claim in principle, and then realize that there's another people, there's a counterclaimant living in the land, I have no choice, not because I want to, not even because I necessarily consider it just. I consider it a profound act of injustice against Jewish history to have to give up Judea and Samaria. And it's not the West Bank for me. And it's certainly not occupied territory. It's Judea and Samaria. But I believe that there are other values, there are other considerations that require me, under the right circumstances, to be ready to give up what belongs to me. Because that's my position, I have no problem with a Palestinian maximalist position as a starting point. The maps that appear in Palestinian offices and schools that don't show the word Israel are not a problem for me, because my internal map does not have the word Palestine on it. But that's, again, my starting point. The question is, can we move from a maximalist theoretical starting point to a practical compromise, which will be an act of injustice against both sides? Partition, and this is what the diplomats, this is what the West generally has failed to understand about this conflict. Partition is not an act of justice. It's an act of injustice against both sides. But that in itself will provide a measure of partial justice for both sides. And given the circumstances, that's the only way that I can see navigating this.
So when you write, we both live this land in its wholeness. We both love this land in its wholeness, and we both must do violence to that love. You mean that there has to be trade-offs and sacrifices?
Yes, and I think that it's crucial that each side understands that the other is giving up something that it believes deeply belongs to them. Palestinians believe that what is today the state of Israel is their ancestral land. And I say, okay, that's right. The state of Israel is yours. The problem is that Hebron and Shiloh and Bethlehem are mine. And so what do we do with that? We can continue fighting for another 100 years, or we can return to the only solution that has been on the table almost from the beginning of this conflict, going back to the 1930s, which is a solution neither side wants, but it's the only solution.
And Abdullah, I want you to say what you were going to say, but I just want to give you a chance to agree or disagree with that framework.
It's not about an agreement or disagreement with me, because I'm not Palestinian and I don't live there. I am in North America. My ultimate loyalty is towards Islam here in the United States. And I would like to see a kind of Islam which is playing its own role, in helpful role, but not importing conflict from Middle East and constantly be seen as a or its relationship with the American Jewish community, North American Jewish community, is seen as if we are both proxies or foot soldiers of an international conflict somewhere there. What I celebrate in what Yossi said is, this is the first time for many of us validating the Palestinian narrative, validating that there is actually a legitimate narrative. I believe and agree, and even religiously can argue, ultimate justice is the most injustice that you could ever imagine. And there are values both in halakha and Islamic law is supersedes justice. Peace necessarily absolute justice. Peace by necessity, if you're going to talk about peace in general terms, it requires suspending part of the justice. There is no another way. I think if somebody says this is my beginning point, not ending point, for a Muslim, for a Palestinian, that beginning point is hurtful, unacceptable. But as long as it's a beginning point, that means there is a room for conversation. There's a room for negotiation. There's a room for engagement. Absolutely.
And so, since one of the litmus tests is just a recognition of a Jewish state, and that many Jews, as you know, certainly in America, feel like as long as Palestinians don't recognize the right to exist, there is no conversation to be had. How do you respond to that as a threshold?
First of all, I think through Shalom Hartman and MLI education, only then we were able to understand what that recognition request means, what that recognition request actually means, in what way that recognition is absolutely necessary, especially in the Middle East, but I would say even globally. When Jews and Muslims talk, there is not even a common language. When we talk, we don't even say the same thing. We don't mean the same things. What you say decoded in my mirror, in my world, differently than what I say in your mirror. I think that conversation is too far from one another, from where we sit. You cannot even bridge. In order to bridge that, you have to build into relationship.
Why is that even a foggy? It's either. Why is that not a yes or no?
It is if you are a Palestinian living in occupied territories for so long, and if that's demanded of you, it doesn't come across as a fair demand to begin with. But for many Muslims living outside of that part of the world, like for a lot of Americans, they really genuinely believe they have no problem in accepting the legitimacy of the State of Israel. That's why they had no problem going there. That's why they have no problem devoting a year of their life studying at an Israeli Zionist institution. For them, it's not even a starting conversation. Many of my Shalom Hartman colleagues, including Yossi, they were surprised when the question is asked to them how puzzled they are. Of course, I never advocated death and destruction of anybody and everybody. But the problem is a lot more complicated.
Yeah, I agree with Abdullah that it's difficult to expect Palestinians who are living under occupation to affirm our legitimacy. But I would argue with you in the sense that if you look at Palestinian society, you look at Palestinian media, we all know that there is a relentless campaign to deny the authenticity of Jewish history, our indigenousness in the land. And so it's one thing to affirm the legitimacy of your occupier. It's another thing to wage war against the authenticity of our story. And that is true in one way or another for most of the Arab world and by extension much of the Muslim world. And so what we try to do in MLI is tell the story of what we call the Zionism of longing, as opposed to the Zionism of need, which was the Zionism of existential crisis. And that's a story that we've all told very well. But in emphasizing the Zionism, as you said earlier, Abdullah, the Zionism of Holocaust, I think we do ourselves a deep disservice for several reasons. First of all, it no longer reflects the reality of Israeli society. A majority of Israelis come from families who left one part of the Middle East and moved to another, had nothing to do with the Holocaust. And this is something that's very hard, understandably, for the American Jewish community to internalize. A majority of Israelis today have no family relationship to the Holocaust. And more deeply, I think that by telling a Holocaust-driven narrative about Israel, we leave ourselves vulnerable to the anti-Zionist assault, because then Israel is a European colonial construct, or as the former Iranian president Ahmadinejad used to like to say, if the Holocaust really happened, then let the Germans create a Jewish state in Germany. And that, of course, erases 4,000 years of Jewish attachment. And you remember, Abdullah, on day one of cohort one, Daniel Hartman was teaching a class about Lech Lecha, the Torah portion where God tells Abraham, leave the land of your fathers, leave your father's home, and go to the land that I will show you. And somebody in MLI in the cohort raises his hand and says, so wait a minute, are you saying that you are in this land not because of the Holocaust, but because you have a 4,000-year connection to this land? So Abdullah leans over and whispers to me, Dayenu.
Abby, if I may, I think we are making demands of each other as Jews and Muslims, and we are demanding respect that we haven't earned yet from each other. and we haven't done the pre-work yet. We are coming each other and demanding things of each other in the languages that we don't speak. There is no common language. I come and make demands in Chinese. You throw back demands in Vietnamese to me. That's why for us to make these demands and come to some sort of a respectful place, my community's moral responsibility and homework is to try to understand Zionism and Israel in a different way. I think my community's responsibility that this is not all about bloodthirsty, racist, European colonial Judeo-Christian crusade for no reason, taking joy out of spilling Palestinian blood. All the lies that's being told needs to be refuted. Muslim anti-Semitism needs to be defeated. And I hope many Jewish organizations and programs like Shalom Hartman and MLI, my community will be given a chance to not defending for Zionism and Israel, not apologizing for it, but explaining what it is. And in that, for those who make that journey, it will be much easier to ask that demand. Do you accept the legitimacy of the state of Israel? And I think my Jewish brothers and sisters' homework, moral responsibility, is to come to terms with, understand, explain, and articulate better what this Jewish homecoming meant for Palestinians. The kind of shattering of a community and people. What, intentionally or unintentionally, Palestinian suffering is not a fiction. It's not a Hollywood movie. It's real. What's going on in Gaza is absolutely real. There's a real human suffering is going on there. I think many of my Jewish brothers and sisters' homework is to pause, especially now that Israel is strong, Jewish community is in a position of not 1920s and 30s anymore, Baruch Hashem, to articulate that empathy and solidarity without necessarily seeing that as a compromise, as a sellout, as a giving up on their own Zionism.
But you're not mentioning Jewish Islamophobia as homework. That's not something that...
It's related to it. If you look at the Jewish Islamophobia, anti-Muslim bigotry in the Jewish community, unlike Christian Islamophobia, which comes a lot of it from theology, which comes a lot of it from really church's relationship with Islam for a very long time. It comes from its history. But if you look at the Jewish Islamophobia, I'm not talking about innocent Jews who listens to what's going on in the world and developing news, but people who are deliberately, intentionally trying to create a cloud of hate and suspicion around Islam and Muslims. People giving millions of dollars of Jewish money spent in a Jewish Islamophobia industry. If you look at this, because they see Islam and Muslims through Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They see Islam equal problem. Muslim influence and prominence, Muslims rising to power in America will automatically, in their own little mind, undermine the Jewish interest or undermine the Jewish American-Israeli relationship. It's all related and connected. The root cause is we are becoming increasingly stuck in our own echo chamber, and the increasing polarization and partisanship is just poisoning the well.
So we're going to go to questions in 1 second. I just want to get to first, I know it's hard to do briefly, Yossi, but please help me be brief here. But the security is what we keep coming back to, is ultimately, if we have this kind of reconciliation and discussion and exchange and trade-offs, as you're suggesting, ultimately, they're going to come and kill us. They want to kill us. That's what I often hear, and not just from the right, but predominantly. But you write about your own ambivalence so many times beautifully through your new book. One thing you say is, I'm horrified by the wall that keeps my children safe. So can you just help us understand how we both look at a wall that some of us may feel ashamed of, but also feel like, thank God that wall is there?
Well, it's not paranoia that much of the Middle East actually does want to come and kill us. And so I think that we need a healthy sense of recognition of threat. And, I'm the son of a Holocaust survivor, and my father taught me that his main takeaway of the Shoah was that Jews need to not Jews need to face reality. Jews need to stop deluding themselves. My father meant it very specifically in terms of Jews need to recognize that they live in a world that wants to kill them. That was really my father's takeaway, and I certainly grew up with that wariness toward the world. When I try to apply my father's lesson in terms of the need for Jews to look at reality without wishful thinking to our predicament in the Middle East, then for me, both the left and the right fall short. The left has consistently minimized the extent and the significance of the denial of our legitimacy in Palestinian society and throughout the Arab world, and the consequences of that denial on our ability to reconcile with the Palestinians. And on the right, there's a continuous denial of the occupation. And I hear this all the time when I speak to Orthodox or right-wing communities, and I speak about the occupation. They say, what occupation? We're not occupying. I served in Gaza as a soldier, and I know what an occupation looks like. And then I'll hear from the right letters to a Palestinian neighbor. There's no such thing as Palestinians. Well, I occupied them. I know they actually exist, and I know that they exist to the point where they were willing to sacrifice for their national identity, and they were willing to go to jail and to throw stones at soldiers. We had guns, they had rocks. So there's a tendency in the two ideological camps to fall into the very trap that my father really tried to warn me about, which is Jews have a primary responsibility, first of all, to look at reality without ideological blinders, whether on the left or on the right. And so that's my approach. And I think it's really the approach today of a majority of Israelis. And most Israelis today, or I would say 60% of Israelis according to polls, support a two-state solution in principle. And in practice, a strong majority believes that a two-state solution would not bring peace. It would actually lead to greater vulnerability. That's the situation now. And in that sense, I'm very much an ordinary, pragmatic Israeli. Where my experience with MLI has forced me to change, and what this book is really about, is that this is a book that's coming not out of a left-wing Israeli sensibility. And it may be the first book about peace that I know of that's written by an Israeli that's actually not a left-wing position. And my position is very centrist. It's very pragmatic. But I believe that to continue to cling to the status quo is to undermine the status quo, because there really is no such thing.
If I may say quickly, nobody is naive. Neither Yossi nor I are hashish smoking peacenik people. And problems in decades of making, centuries of making, it doesn't go away that easily, quickly. But history has shown over and over, if it goes in the right direction, incremental progress in achieving peace, sites that have been in fight for decades and centuries. I was just in Germany at a Frankfurt University in the building that the gas that has been used to kill the Holocaust victims have been invented and developed. In the very same building dedicated to Christian-Jewish relationship, I was giving a keynote speech as a Muslim there. It's incredible. Look, in 70, 80 years, how far we came along. We cannot give into hopelessness. I will give two quick examples. Forget about security situation is absolutely real in the Middle East, absolutely real in Gaza and the West Bank. What about almost 2 million, 1.8, 1.9 million Palestinians, Israeli Arabs, who are living in Israel? There is no wall, there is no safety and security situation. There's a friend of mine who works for an organization doing incredible amount of good work, trying to improve the Arab sector's conditions in Israel, Israeli society. Givat Haviva. I highly encourage you to look at organizations like this and others, what they are doing. They did, for example, bringing Israeli Jewish Hebrew teachers into Arab schools to teach them Hebrew, and then bringing Arab teachers to teach Arabic in Israeli high schools. Jewish. And initially, oh my God, the Israeli Jewish teachers, Hebrew teachers, will be killed in Arab towns, and the Arab teachers in the Jewish schools will be stoned or will be facing discrimination. None of it happened. None of it happened. And if Israel really, or Palestinians in that sense, really would like to prove themselves that they can actually live side by side in peace, here is a micro laboratory. You have no reason not to see a little bit of more equity, a little bit more parity, a little bit more cohesion, social harmony. And forget about Israel-Palestine. Here in America, between Jews and Muslims, shame on us if we cannot say more than talking points of the politicians and the religious leaders of Muslims. Shame on us if we cannot defeat Muslim anti-Semitism here in America. Shame on us if the Jewish Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bigotry goes unchallenged, despite all the goodwill and the decency exists in the Jewish communities. What about here?
I just want to, moderator's prerogative, give time for Yossi to sign books, which I hope you will buy, but I want to end with a quote from his book. "We live in such intimacy, we can almost hear each other breathing. What choice do we have but to share this land?" Thank you both.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.